After nearly 4 tumultuous years under former Mayor Rob Ford, calm seems to be restored at City Hall. For a look at the past year under Mayor Tory and what's in store for this year's budget, we have Toronto Star City Hall Bureau Chief David Ryder. Thank you for joining us, David.
Happy to be here.
So David, we're 1 year into Mayor Tory's term. Give us the highlights, the lowlights.
Yeah, I think, I'll say, I think most people on the street would be, I guess, twofold. They would probably be saying, when I talk to people, they're like, he's doing a good job, right? But they're not so focused on the way people were so focused on City Hall during Rob Ford's sort of tumultuous, kind of chaotic 4-year term. So I would say that John Tory is being like a fairly quiet mayor compared to Mayor Ford, but who couldn't be. We're heading into the second year of his term. I'd say the first year, some people would say like what's going on? Like you talked about Smart Track being this big transit plan, but what has really happened? You talked about poverty reduction, but what have we really done? I'd say, basically he said in year-end interviews, his job was kind of getting the city back on track and bringing stability back to City Hall and being able to work in a window where anybody can walk up and look at him, seeing there and know what their mayor's doing. But actually, we have seen the last week, we had actually 3 major changes in direction on different policies, on transit on the Smart Track, on the Scarborough Subway file, and also on the Gardiner Expressway. So things feel like they're starting to move. I would say, I think probably not being Rob Ford is an ace in the hole that he can ride for a while. I think most people would say the mayor seems to be doing okay.
So it's a less divided council with Tory working both sides of it.
Right. It is still always going to be a divided council. John Tory is a small C Conservative. There are people, I'd say Gord Perks would be a councillor who is sort of on the left side of the political spectrum, is going to be his main nemesis. Yeah, there's lots of them. Yeah. But definitely it is not what we saw during the Rob Ford years. Rob Ford, it was really trench warfare. Like it was a demonization of the other side. I'll say primarily from the mayor's side. Anybody on the left was terrible and we can't work with them and we're just going to freeze them out. And if we need them for a vote, we're essentially going to try and threaten them into going our way. That is not happening now. And even in big debates like the Gardiner Expressway, people will get up and say, we're thankful that this was done in a respectful way and that the arguments are about policy. And they're not about, not so much about political spectrum.
So let's pick up on some of these issues. Let's start with Smart Track.
Right.
A lot of fanfare. It was the centerpiece of Tory's campaign.
That's right.
And a year in, not 1 meter has been started.
No. I'd say this is an argument for, if anything, maybe to overpromise during a campaign, because you will get elected and then people, you have to deliver on something. But yeah, the mayor said during the campaign, I'm going to build this surface subway. It's going to bring transit to all parts of the city that are now underserviced. It's going to be 53 kilometers. It was 22 stops. It's going to cost us $8 billion, but we're going to get the federal and province each to pay 1/3. And I'm going to plan it and build it within 7 years. Now, I think most transit experts said that's impossible.
Pie in the sky?
Yeah, you have to get it through council first, which itself is, you got to get reports and then you got to make political arguments. That alone is at least a year. We're more than a year in and we haven't got there yet. All we've got is reports coming. And also, I remember people who looked at the map, including my own neighborhood. I had neighbors saying, "Oh my God, they're going to take our park for a Smart Track stop." And I'd say, no, that's a campaign document. That's somebody has drawn that on map, but reality will come later, and there's not going to be a thing in a park. So the mayor has basically got some funding commitments from the federal and provincial government, and he has got city staff looking at it. And there was one big problem, which was the so-called Western Spur, which went from the Mount Dennis neighborhood in the West End out to the Airport Corporate Center in Mississauga. It was on the map and it looked easy to do, but everybody who was looking at it was saying, there's neighborhoods in the way, you're not going to demolish them, now then you have to dig. If you dig, it's going to cost you billions of dollars more. It's going to be another fight at council. He finally acknowledged that, and he came back with a revised plan through city planners, but obviously with the mayor's stamp of approval that says we're not going to dig, we're going to build it above ground, we're going to have an LRT for much of it, it's not going to be heavy rail like a subway. So he's he's changed course on that. But you're right, like I still think the idea that this thing could be built, like he said, in 7 years seems completely impossible.
So let's now just transition over to the Scarborough Subway.
Yes.
And yet again, we have another revised plan.
Right.
This time involving a one-stop.
Yes.
And integrating LRT into a number of other elements.
Right. So the Scarborough Subway is something Mayor Tory inherited. It's not his plan, and he didn't promise it. This was really a Rob Ford plan. Rob Ford said Scarborough deserves a subway, Scarborough needs respect, and after a lot of convincing, got a majority of councillors to say, okay, we're going to spend a lot of money on a 3-stop subway extension. Now, my paper and others have pointed out that there's all kinds of issues. One is that a smart track line goes essentially parallel, not that far away, and aren't they just going to cannibalize ridership from each other if you build it? Also, which road? McCowan seemed to be the obvious one, but that's the closest to smart track. At one point, the mayor's office was floating Bellamy Road. A reporter in my bureau went out there. This is a leafy green residential street. Yeah, it would
Two
be,
lanes.
Exactly. Yeah, it really would be. Putting a subway there made no sense. Finally, the city planner came back and said, "Okay, we're going to extend it one stop. So we're going to go to Scarborough Town Centre, and then we're going to run the LRT along Eglinton." Farther east, which makes a continuous track across the top of or across the middle of the city, pardon me, on LRT, and that seems to make the most sense. So that's, I think it was kind of described as a perfectly imperfect solution. It's not. I think most,
typically Canadian
exactly.
solution.
Most transit planners would probably say the subway part really doesn't go there, and probably the LRT could hit more places like Centennial College if you rerouted it. But it lets the city councillors and the provincial politicians like Brad Dogood, who represents Scarborough, who were very much solidly in the subway.
Mitzi Hunter campaigned in the by-election.
Subway champion, yeah. Previously, really had talked about LRT when she was at Civic Action, was suddenly holding a sign saying subway champion, and it worked. This lets them say, okay, we are building a subway, even if it's only one stop, and it lets the planners say, we're hitting more people, we're able to bring a lot more people in, and we're able to do it cheaper, because LRT on the surface is automatically going to be dramatically cheaper than having to dig.
So let's shift gears and talk about paying for all of this.
Yes.
And we've got a budget that's being presented to Executive Council and now winding its way through.
Right.
There's going to be a tax increase.
Yes.
Apparently at the
It'll be
cost
about
of living,
about 1.8%.
1.8.
But then there's also a surcharge for the Scarborough Subway.
A surcharge,
Yes.
and there's increases in different fees.
Yes.
Significant increases in some of them.
Garbage bins and recreation and everything else. There has been user fees on average have been marching up fairly dramatically for the last 5 or 6 years at least. I think one of the things with Rob Ford was, he's going to keep either freeze taxes or just have it go up a bit. But of course, you have to pay the bills, and inflation marches on. So one of the ways was that user fees would go up for almost everything.
Police, emergency services, TTC, and debt payment.
Yes.
Covers 70% of the budget.
Yeah.
And we saw that the police got their increase. They've done well over the past, as have the fire, and to a lesser extent, the ambulance and emergency services.
Right.
Now, when you have that large nut to crack,
Yes.
there's very little wiggle room anywhere else.
There is, yeah, you're right.
So how is Tory going to rein in costs? Because he talked about that during the campaign, was that he was going to be able to stand up and be able to, deal with the cost issue at City Hall.
With great difficulty, I guess, that old joke about, how does anybody do anything with great difficulty? I mean, really, right now, for part of the budget, the budget chief, they're literally telling bureaucrats, like, don't spend any money more on paper clips and notebooks. Like, it's got to the point where you really, like, people would think literally nickels and dimes to save. Because under Rob Ford, we had a management consultant, KPMG, come in and do what was supposedly like a top to bottom thing. And they came back saying there actually is a lot less waste. Even people around Mayor Ford at the time said, well, the gravy train doesn't exist. Nick Cavallo said. So what we're looking at is minor things. You're right. To make a real change, you have to do things like reducing police costs, which is a big political minefield. But definitely their costs of police especially has gone up in a way that no other department has been allowed to.
Mm-hmm. Well, the City of Toronto budget is, I believe, somewhere around $11 or $12 billion.
For the operating side, about $11 billion. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that's larger than a number of provinces.
I think we're the 6th largest government in Canada is the City of Toronto. Way bigger than like a New
Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Manitoba.
Right. Exactly.
Places like that.
Yeah.
So, we're talking about a big budget, $11 billion. Saving paper clips is not going to really have an impact on that budget.
All it's going to do is it maybe frees up $2 or $3 or $5 million, which I know to the average person sounds like a lot of money, but in the scheme of an $11 billion budget just for operating, forget all capital and buying actual things. What it can do when you get down to this part of the budget, actually, like when you get into $2 or $5 or $10 million, it actually can make a big difference in, say, how many student free breakfasts you provide. Mm-hmm. So what it can do, that kind of saving, it can basically get the mayor through this budget. The trick for him, I think, is the last budget. It was kind of like, oh, we just had an election year. This one was mostly crafted by the bureaucrats. We're going to pass this, and then we're going to do the real work. We're getting a bit of that. They're still calling it a transitional budget, which makes people like me say, well, when do you actually roll up your sleeves? And if you can't do the things you want to do, if there's no gravy train, like what are you going to do? The left would say you're going to have to face reality and raise property taxes or introduce revenue tools, and maybe shopping centers are going to have to pay for parking spaces to the city or do something. Mayor Tory, I think, is still saying, well, we can find efficiencies.
David, thank you so much. There's so much more that we could talk about, and I hope you'll come back again.
Anytime.
I was joined by David Ryder, Bureau Chief for the Toronto Star at City Hall. Up next, the Budget Chief shares the numbers.